In the shadow of Viking society, hidden behind myths and legends, lies the truth of the Volvas, women whose mystical rituals bridged the worlds of gods, spirits, and humans. These seers could tap into fate, bend time, and alter the course of history with ancient rites lost to time. But what if this forgotten knowledge, suppressed for centuries, holds secrets that could unravel the very fabric of reality? What if the power to manipulate the future, shape destinies, and communicate with the divine was real and could be recovered? The veil between the living and the dead was a concept that haunted many ancient cultures, but in the Norse world, it was more than just a belief. It was a real, tangible force that shaped their understanding of the cosmos and their place within it. For the Norse shamans, the Volvas, the border between worlds wasn't something that could be explained away with mere philosophy or speculation. They believed they could actually cross that boundary, stepping beyond the limitations of human perception into realms where the gods, spirits, and forces of nature resided. These crossings were not just metaphysical journeys. They were ritualistic, powerful, and deeply connected to the forces that govern life, death, and everything in between. In the harsh, unforgiving world of the Vikings, where survival depended on more than just brute strength, these practices were essential to understanding fate, manipulating the elements, and securing victory in battle. The Norse shamans believed that to access the other world was to tap into a force that could shape their destiny. But what if everything we've been told about these rituals, these otherworldly realms, and the shamans themselves has been deliberately obscured? What if the truths that lay buried in the Norse myths and the sagas have been suppressed to prevent modern-day society from uncovering knowledge so powerful it could unravel the very fabric of reality? Imagine the profound impact on our understanding of history and spirituality if we could recover the lost rituals of the Volvas, those who, through ancient rituals, claim to walk between worlds, communicate with gods, and foretell the future. Their ability to transcend the boundaries of life and death wasn't just reserved for spiritual contemplation. It had practical applications that shaped Norse society, from deciding the outcome of battles to guiding the dead to their final resting place. These rituals had the power to influence the very course of existence. The Volvas were not just spiritual leaders. They were the intermediaries between the human world and the divine. Their role was multifaceted and often misunderstood. When we think of shamans today, we often imagine solitary figures, mystics whose role is primarily spiritual, tending to their own visions and guiding others through personal journeys of enlightenment. But the Volvas were much more than that. They were seers, guides, warriors, and healers. They were consulted by kings, warriors, and even the gods themselves. These shamans understood something fundamental about the universe, that the forces of nature were not separate from the human experience, but intricately connected to it. Everything, life, death, fate, the elements, was part of a vast interconnected web of energy. And through their rituals, the Volvas could tap into this energy, influence the present, and manipulate the future. But this wasn't something everyone could do. Becoming a Volva was a rare and complex process. To gain this knowledge, one had to undergo initiation rituals that would often involve long periods of seclusion, intense spiritual trials, and communion with the divine forces of the cosmos. These shamans didn't simply learn magic, they were chosen. The rituals they practiced were not just about acquiring knowledge. They were about transcending the normal human limitations and opening the doors to other realms. To walk between worlds, a Volva had to be willing to sacrifice a part of themselves, their very essence, in order to gain access to these otherworldly domains. Imagine standing at the threshold of reality as we know it, knowing that beyond this veil lay something greater, something that could change the course of your life, your community, or even the fate of entire nations. It wasn't just about the pursuit of knowledge or power. It was about survival. The Norse people lived in a world where the future was uncertain, where death could come at any moment, and where the whims of the gods were as unpredictable as the harsh winters they endured. The ability to see the future, to understand the will of the gods, or to communicate with the spirits of the dead could make the difference between life and death, victory and defeat. But what if this power, the ability to connect to these otherworldly forces, wasn't as mystical as we've been led to believe? What if, instead of being the stuff of myth and legend, these rituals were based on something far more profound? Could it be that the vulvas were tapping into energies or phenomena that modern science has yet to fully understand? What if the knowledge of these practices had been deliberately hidden from the world, not because they were magical in the traditional sense, but because they could alter the very fabric of reality itself? The idea that these shamans had access to such potent forces is not as far-fetched as it might first appear. Across cultures, there are similar accounts of individuals who claim to have crossed into other realms of existence. Shamans, mystics, and spiritual leaders who, through ritual or altered states of consciousness, are able to access dimensions beyond our own. And while these stories are often dismissed by mainstream science as mere superstition or fantasy, there are increasingly compelling arguments to suggest that there may be more to these ancient practices than we have been taught. Could the vulvas have truly crossed into other realms? And if so, what did they experience there? It's important to remember that the Norse didn't view the gods and the other worlds in the same way we do today. For them, the divine and the supernatural were not distant, abstract concepts. They were immediate and tangible forces that influenced every aspect of life. The gods weren't just symbols or archetypes. They were real, living entities that could be interacted with, bargained with, or even manipulated through ritual. The vulvas were able to walk between these worlds not because they were special individuals, but because they were able to tap into a fundamental understanding of the universe that most people could not access. Through ritual and spiritual discipline, they could open portals between worlds and step beyond the veil, gaining knowledge and power from realms that lay hidden to others. This idea of crossing the boundary between worlds, of reaching into the unseen, is not just unique to the Norse. Across different cultures, from Siberian shamans to the mystics of ancient Egypt, there are accounts of individuals who have traveled to other realms, who have communed with gods and spirits, and who have seen things that defy our understanding of reality. In many ways, the vulvas were part of a broader tradition of individuals who existed at the fringes of society, capable of accessing realms that others could not even imagine. But here's the question that remains. Why was this knowledge hidden? Why did these rituals fade into obscurity? There are hints in the historical record that the power of the vulvas was seen as a threat. As the Norse world transitioned from paganism to Christianity, the ancient knowledge of the shamans was viewed with increasing suspicion. The rise of Christianity didn't just bring a new religious order, it brought with it a new way of seeing the world. The idea that humans could communicate directly with the divine or access hidden realms was incompatible with the Christian worldview. And so, much of the ancient shamanic knowledge was erased, dismissed as superstition or witchcraft. Perhaps the greatest tragedy of all is that this knowledge was lost, not just to history, but to humanity. What could we learn if we were to rediscover these ancient rituals? Could we unlock the secrets of the universe, gain access to forgotten realms, or perhaps even learn to manipulate the fabric of reality itself? These are the questions that haunt us as we stand at the edge of this vast, unexplored mystery. In the end, the story of the vulvas is not just one of ancient rituals and forgotten knowledge. It is the story of humanity's eternal search for meaning, for connection, and for understanding. It is the story of our desire to reach beyond the veil, to uncover the mysteries that lie hidden just out of reach. And it is the story of the profound, unsettling question: what happens when we do? When we reach too far, when we step beyond the limits of what we know, do we risk losing ourselves in the process? The answer to this question may be hidden in the forgotten rituals of the Norse shamans, a mystery that, if uncovered, could change everything. To understand the powerful role of the vulvas, the Norse shamans, we must first step into the shoes of these mysterious figures and explore who they were. The Volvas were not simply mystics or practitioners of magic. They were the spiritual leaders, the seers, the guides who bridged the gap between the human world and the supernatural realms. In Norse society, their role was indispensable, yet shrouded in secrecy, woven deeply into the fabric of their beliefs, rituals, and worldview. These individuals weren't just gifted with spiritual insight, nor were they merely wise women or men who dabbled in herbs and potions. They were powerful agents of fate, capable of altering the course of events through the very rituals they performed. What set the Volvas apart was not only their ability to communicate with spirits or divine forces, but their unique connection to the very structure of existence itself. They existed in a space between worlds, navigating the realms of gods and mortals, wielding knowledge that could shape the lives of individuals, entire clans, and even nations. The Volvas were often women, but not always. In a society like that of the Norse, where power and social structure were often dictated by strength, status, and lineage, the role of the Volva was an anomaly. In some ways, their power was more significant than that of warriors or kings. While a king could command armies and conquer lands, a Volva could sway the winds of fate itself. She could stand before a great warrior and pronounce the outcome of his battle, and she could decide whether the future of an entire clan would be prosperous or fall to ruin. These women, often revered and feared in equal measure, were the keepers of ancient wisdom, and their knowledge was passed down through generations. In the mythos of the Norse, the Volvas were described as women who possessed a kind of magical insight. They were often portrayed as wise, old figures, sometimes with strange and otherworldly powers. In some instances, they were thought to have the ability to cast seer, a powerful form of Norse magic that involved deep trance states, divination, and the manipulation of fate. Through seer, the Volvas could see into the future, commune with spirits, and even alter the course of events. Their abilities were not simply attributed to knowledge, but to an inherent connection to the divine. For the Norse, the gods were not distant, mythical figures. They were as real and present as the mountains and rivers. The Volvas were believed to have the unique ability to speak to these gods, to commune with them, and to interpret their will. In many ways, the Volvas stood in a position of great power, often one that transcended the influence of kings or warriors. These figures weren't just spiritual leaders. They held social and political sway as well. Kings would often seek out Volvas to gain insight into the future or to ensure the favor of the gods before embarking on a crucial mission or a battle. To some extent, the Volvas were treated as oracles, and their words could dictate the decisions of even the most powerful men in the kingdom. They could foresee which battles would be won or lost, and which alliances were fated to succeed or fail. In many ways, their prophecies shaped the course of Viking history. This wasn't limited to just predicting the future. It was about controlling it. A Volva's words had the power to sway leaders, direct warriors, and guide the actions of entire communities. The relationship between a Volva and the gods was a complex one. It wasn't that the gods simply spoke to the Volva. It was a mutual exchange. The Volvas were seen as having access to hidden knowledge, the sort that could only be obtained through years of intense study, ritual, and spiritual dedication. They were often initiated into their roles after long periods of seclusion, during which they would undergo rigorous tests, either physical, mental, or spiritual, to prove themselves worthy. This was no mere position granted by birthright. It was something that had to be earned. Some say that the Volvas went into deep trances, journeying through the spirit world to learn secrets that were hidden from the mortal eye. It was through these altered states that they could access the divine and, in turn, pass down their wisdom to those who sought their counsel. The power of the Volvas wasn't merely theoretical or symbolic. It was practical. In a world that was as harsh as that of the Norse, where survival was often uncertain, the knowledge these shamans held could literally mean the difference between life and death. Their ability to predict the future, communicate with spirits, and even call upon gods to influence the natural world was invaluable. In a society so deeply connected to the land, to the sea, and to the unpredictable forces of nature, the ability to understand and manipulate these forces was not just a spiritual gift. It was a survival tool. When a vulva performed a ritual, it wasn't merely a display of mysticism or superstition. These rituals were serious, deeply embedded in the culture and beliefs of the time. The vulvas would engage in sacred practices that could influence the very forces that govern nature: rain, wind, fire, and earth. When a battle loomed, or when a clan was in need of direction, it was the vulvas who were called upon to offer their wisdom and guidance. They could conduct rituals to ensure the success of a raid, or to provide protection to a leader embarking on a dangerous journey. What made the vulvas even more fascinating was the fact that they were so intertwined with the very fabric of Norse society. Their powers were not limited to the realm of the spiritual. They were integrated into the daily lives of the people. The vulvas were not just removed figures who lived in isolation. They were part of the community, and their rituals were often conducted in public. Their influence was widespread, and their reach extended far beyond the confines of the ritual space. They had the ability to affect the destinies of individuals, entire clans, and even the fate of kings. The vulvas were integral to the daily life of the Vikings, and their role could not be overstated. Yet, despite their power and influence, the vulvas were often marginalized in the historical record. Much of what we know about them comes from sagas and myths, where their roles are often exaggerated, sensationalized, or at times distorted. In a world that valued physical strength and military prowess, the vulvas were often seen as outcasts or figures who operated on the fringes of society. And while they were respected in many circles, they were also feared for the very powers that made them so valuable to the community. This fear and respect made the vulvas into enigmatic figures. While their abilities were undeniable, the Norse people understood that the forces they dealt with were dangerous, unpredictable, and not to be trifled with. Their power came from a deep understanding of the cosmos, and the price of that knowledge could be steep. The rituals they performed often required sacrifices, whether physical, emotional, or spiritual. For a vulva to journey between worlds meant they were leaving behind part of themselves, stepping into a realm where time, space, and reality itself could bend and warp. The danger of crossing into other realms wasn't just a matter of dealing with unknown gods or spirits. It was about losing oneself in the process. But what was even more profound was the deep, almost cosmic relationship between the vulvas and the world they inhabited. To be a vulva was to possess an innate understanding of how everything, life, death, fate, and the divine, was interconnected. They didn't see themselves as separate from the gods, the spirits, or the forces of nature. They were a part of that tapestry. The vulvas didn't just access spiritual realms for personal gain or entertainment. They did so to fulfill a sacred purpose, to serve as the human connection to the divine order of the universe. They were the conduits, the bridges, through which the will of the gods could manifest in the world of man. As we delve deeper into their rituals and beliefs, we come to realize that the vulvas weren't just mystics or wise women. They were the very embodiment of the Norse understanding of the universe itself. They connected the physical world to the spiritual, bridging the realms of gods and men, fate and free will, life and death. And in this connection, they found their power, their purpose, and their place in the grand design of the cosmos. Their role was not just to predict the future or to commune with the gods. It was to navigate the very fabric of reality and bring it into alignment with the will of the divine. Their knowledge was more than just ancient wisdom. It was the key to unlocking the deeper mysteries of existence itself. To truly grasp the power of the vulvas and the importance of their rituals, we must first understand the deeply rooted Norse belief in multiple spiritual realms, each one distinct but intimately connected to the human world. The Norse cosmos was far more than just the physical world in which humans lived. It was a vast, intricate web of interconnected realms, each one home to different beings, forces, and energies. At the center of this belief system was the idea that there existed a border, a veil, that separated the mortal world from the divine and supernatural. It wasn't just a metaphorical divide. For the Norse, it was a real, tangible barrier that could be crossed through certain rituals, rites, and magical practices. These spiritual realms weren't distant, abstract concepts. They were alive with power and influence, and the Volvas were believed to be the key figures who could traverse them. In Norse cosmology, there were 9 distinct realms, each with its own purpose, its own entities, and its own rules. These realms were interconnected, forming a giant tree-like structure known as Yggdrasil, the world tree. The 9 realms were all linked to one another, and the Volvas were believed to be able to travel between them through their rituals. Some of these realms were beautiful and filled with light, while others were dark and chaotic, home to the dead or to forces that were difficult for humans to comprehend. But the key point to understand is that, for the Norse, these realms weren't just places of imagination. They were living, breathing parts of the world. They were real, and the Volvas, through their shamanic rituals, could tap into these realms, gaining knowledge and power that others could not. At the heart of the Norse worldview was the belief in a spiritual connection between all realms. The gods weren't just distant, omnipotent beings who lived far away. They were accessible, present, and, most importantly, involved in the lives of humans. To the Norse, the gods and the realms they inhabited were not separate from their lives. They were intrinsic parts of their reality. The Volvas understood this connection better than anyone else, for they had the ability to step outside the confines of the mortal world and enter these other realms, communicating with gods, spirits, and the forces of nature in ways that ordinary people could not. One of the most important realms in the Norse cosmology was Asgard, the home of the gods. Asgard was where the chief gods of the Norse pantheon, such as Odin, Thor, and Freya, resided. The gods in Asgard were powerful, but their influence over the mortal world was indirect. The Volvas could travel to Asgard, or at least tap into the knowledge of the gods who resided there, through their rituals. The Volvas didn't just communicate with gods in a passive way. They were able to actively engage with them, seeking guidance, knowledge, and even the gods' intervention in the affairs of mortals. This wasn't a one-way communication. It was a dynamic exchange that was essential for the Volva's role as mediators between the worlds of humans and gods. The realm of Midgard, where humans lived, was directly linked to these divine and supernatural worlds. The Volvas understood that what happened in one realm could influence the others. They weren't just concerned with human affairs. They were aware that the movements of the gods, the spirits, and even the forces of nature had an impact on the world of men. When a Volva performed a ritual, she wasn't just seeking information for herself or those who came to her for help. She was tapping into an interconnected web of forces that bound the realms together. In doing so, she could influence events in the mortal world by manipulating the forces in the spiritual realms. The realm of Hel, the land of the dead, was another crucial aspect of the Norse spiritual system. This realm, ruled by the goddess Hel, was where the souls of those who died a dishonorable death were said to dwell. While it was often depicted as a bleak, desolate place, it was also a realm of great power. The Volvas had a unique connection to this realm, for they were not just concerned with life. They were tasked with guiding the souls of the dead to their final resting place. The Volvas believed that the dead were not merely forgotten once they passed. Their spirits continued to influence the living, and it was through rituals that the Volvas could ensure that the dead made their journey safely to Hel, or even to other realms like Valhalla, depending on their deeds in life. But it wasn't just a matter of guiding souls. It was about communication with the dead. The Volvas had the power to communicate with spirits, whether they were the spirits of ancestors or the shades of fallen warriors. This was one of the most profound aspects of their role. In Norse society, the dead were not simply gone. They were part of the ongoing story of the living. The Volvas could tap into this spiritual network, using their rituals to bring messages from the dead, seek guidance from ancestral spirits, or even gain insight into future events by communicating with spirits who were beyond the mortal realm. This ability to move between the worlds of life and death made the Volvas indispensable figures in Norse society, for they held the power to influence both the living and the dead. The concept of fate, or WIRD, was another key element of the Norse worldview that the Volvas navigated. The Norse believed that fate was a force that shaped the lives of individuals, clans, and even nations. But unlike in other cultures, where fate was seen as a predetermined, unchangeable force, the Norse saw it as something that could be influenced. The Volvas were the individuals who could tap into this force, seeing glimpses of the future and understanding the intricacies of fate. Through their rituals, they could alter the course of events, foretell the outcome of battles, and even change the destiny of individuals or families. The ability to perceive and manipulate WIRD was one of the most powerful aspects of the Volva's abilities. Their rituals were not just about divining the future. They were about influencing it, shaping it, and controlling it. The ritual practice of seed, which was the primary form of magic practice by the Volvas, was designed specifically to access these spiritual realms and interact with the forces that govern them. Seedra involved intense trance states, during which the Volva would journey to other realms, communicating with gods, spirits, and otherworldly beings. It was through Seedra that the Volvas could see visions of the future, commune with the dead, and even influence the outcome of battles and events. The Volvas didn't just access these realms for their own gain. They did so with the intention of helping others, shaping the destiny of their people, and aligning the mortal world with the forces of nature and the divine. The practice of Seedr was a highly spiritual and intense experience. The Volvas would enter into a deep trance, often through chanting, singing, or rhythmic drumming, which would allow them to leave their physical bodies behind and journey into other realms. It wasn't a passive form of magic. It required great strength, focus, and understanding. The Volvas would seek out the gods and spirits of the realms, asking for guidance, knowledge, or assistance in matters of importance. Whether they were calling upon the power of Odin for wisdom, Freya for love and fertility, or the spirits of the dead for insights, the Volvas knew how to navigate these realms and bring back the information or power that was needed. These otherworldly journeys were not without their risks. To enter these realms was to leave behind the safety and structure of the mortal world. There was always the danger that the Volva could become lost in the spiritual realms, forever trapped in a world beyond human understanding. The Volvas were not invincible. They were simply human, and their powers came with a price. To travel between worlds required immense concentration, and the consequences of failing could be disastrous. Some accounts suggest that if a Volva failed to complete her ritual or was overwhelmed by the forces she encountered, she could become lost in the spirit world, never to return. Yet despite these risks, the Volvas continued to practice their art, and their power only grew. They became the conduits through which the will of the gods and the forces of the universe could be enacted in the world of humans. The realms they accessed weren't distant and unreachable. They were as much a part of the Norse worldview as the trees, mountains, and seas. The Volvas didn't just see into other realms. They connected with them. They walked through them, and they brought their wisdom back to guide the lives of the living. Their ability to navigate these realms made them some of the most powerful figures in Norse society, and their influence extended far beyond the confines of ritual and magic. They were the true bridge between the mortal world and the divine, shaping the future and guiding the past. The ancient rituals practiced by the Volvas were not mere performances or symbolic gestures. They were the very tools through which these Norse shamans navigated the thin, permeable boundary between the realms of the living and the otherworldly. For the Volvas, these rituals were the pathways through which they accessed divine wisdom, communicated with spirits, and influenced the very forces that governed fate, nature, and life itself. The rituals were more than just acts of magic. They were sacred, deeply transformative experiences that allowed the Volvas to reach into the very fabric of reality and shape the destiny of individuals, clans, and even entire civilizations. To understand the true power of these rituals, one must first acknowledge that the Norse saw the cosmos as an interconnected system where all beings, gods, humans, spirits, and the elements, were inextricably linked. The Volvas were the only individuals who had the knowledge and the ability to manipulate this system, to enter the spiritual realms and make contact with gods, spirits, and otherworldly beings. But the rituals they performed were not simple or easy. They required an immense understanding of both the mystical forces at play and the subtleties of the spiritual realms. The most well-known of these rituals was Seeder, a practice that was closely tied to the Norse gods, particularly the goddess Freya. Seeder was often described as a form of magic that involved trance-like states, prophecies, and the manipulation of fate. It wasn't just a passive form of divination. It was active, requiring the Volva to channel the forces of the cosmos in order to influence the world around them. It was through Seeder that the Volvas could see into the future, speak to the dead, control the elements, and shape the very fabric of existence. The ritual was deeply immersive, often inducing altered states of consciousness in the practitioner, allowing her to transcend her physical body and enter the realms of the gods and spirits. In these realms, she could obtain knowledge, foresight, and even power that could be brought back to the mortal world to aid in important matters such as warfare, agriculture, and political leadership. While the Volvas were often depicted as women, Seeder was not exclusive to the female sex. However, women were more frequently associated with the practice, and it was often considered a feminine form of magic in Norse society. This gendered association with Seeder is one of the reasons why it was sometimes viewed with suspicion, particularly by the more patriarchal members of Viking society. The ability of women to access such profound powers through their connection with the divine and the spiritual realms threatened the traditional social order, where male warriors and leaders held power and prestige. As a result, the practice of Seeder was sometimes vilified, with accusations of witchcraft and sorcery leveled against the Volvas who practiced it. But this perception was rooted in fear of the unknown, fear of losing control over the forces that shaped the world, and fear of the women who wielded the power to influence those forces. The rituals of Seeder involve a combination of elements: chanting, drumming, singing, and the use of ritual tools. These practices were designed to alter the state of consciousness, allowing the Volva to enter a trance where the physical world faded away and the spiritual realms became more immediate. In these altered states, the Volvas could receive visions of the future, access hidden knowledge, and even summon spirits. They would often sit in a circle, surrounded by the tools of their craft: wooden staffs, sacred runes, animal skins, and ceremonial objects. While they entered these deep, trance-like states, their chanting would fill the air, creating a rhythmic pulse that would help them enter the spiritual realm and establish a connection with the divine forces. It was in these moments, when their consciousness transcended the ordinary limits of space and time, that the Volvas could cross the boundaries between the worlds and interact with gods, spirits, and other entities. The ritual space was always sacred, carefully prepared to ensure that the energies of the world could flow freely. It was important that the Volvas created an environment where the spiritual forces could be invited to enter, a space that was clear of negative energies or distractions. The tools used in these rituals were not just symbolic. They were believed to have inherent magical power that could amplify the connection between the practitioner and the spiritual realms. These tools included staffs or wands, which were used to direct the flow of energy, and runes, which were symbols believed to hold powerful magical properties. These sacred symbols would be drawn on the ground or carved into objects, acting as a conduit for the divine forces that the Volvas sought to channel. The act of Seeder was often accompanied by drumming or chanting, both of which served to induce an altered state of consciousness. The repetitive, rhythmic sounds of the drums and the chants would echo through the ritual space, creating a trance-like atmosphere that helped the Volvas enter the spiritual realm. The chants were often in Old Norse, and their words had a deep, magical resonance. The Volvas would speak these words in order to call upon the gods, spirits, and forces of nature. invoking their power and asking for their guidance. The chants themselves were not merely words. They were believed to be living entities, imbued with magical properties that could shape the world. The ritual could also involve offerings, sacrifices, and invocations. These were made to honor the gods or to ask for their help in specific matters. In Norse society, offerings were considered essential to maintaining a harmonious relationship with the divine. The Volvas would offer food, drink, or other precious items to the gods and spirits in exchange for their favor. Sometimes, blood sacrifices were made as part of these rituals, as it was believed that the offering of life force could invoke the greatest power from the spiritual realms. While this may seem shocking or barbaric to modern sensibilities, it was deeply ingrained in the Norse understanding of how the world worked. Everything in the universe was connected, and in order to tap into the spiritual realm, one had to offer something in return. It was an exchange of energy, life for knowledge, sacrifice for power. The results of these rituals could be far-reaching and profound. One of the key aspects of Seeder was the ability to influence fate itself. The Norse believed in the concept of Wyrd, a force that determined the fate of individuals and the course of events. While the Norse had a belief in destiny, they did not see it as a fixed, unchangeable path. Rather, they saw fate as a river. While the current might push one in a certain direction, there was always the possibility of changing course. The Volvas could tap into this current and influence the flow of fate. Through their rituals, they could see glimpses of the future, speak with ancestors, and even shape the outcomes of battles and events. By interacting with the gods and spirits, the Volvas could manipulate Wyrd, altering the course of destiny to suit their needs or those of their people. The ability to foretell the future and alter fate was perhaps the most coveted and respected aspect of Seeder. Warriors and kings would seek out the Volvas before embarking on important campaigns or battles, hoping to gain an edge over their enemies. The Volvas would often conduct a ritual to divine the outcome of the conflict, calling upon the gods to reveal the future. In some cases, they would also attempt to alter the course of events, invoking the power of the divine to ensure that their side would emerge victorious. The Volvas were not just passive seers. They were active participants in shaping the future, using their connection with the divine forces to influence the world around them. But it wasn't just warfare that the Volvas could influence. Their rituals were also used to protect the harvest, ensure the fertility of animals, and provide guidance in matters of personal relationships. In a world where life was hard and the forces of nature were unpredictable, the Volvas were the people who could provide hope, guidance, and answers in times of need. Their rituals were a means of aligning the physical world with the spiritual, ensuring that the balance of nature was maintained and that the will of the gods was carried out. The practice of Seeder was not without its risks. As powerful as it was also dangerous. The spiritual realms were not always friendly, and the Volvas could easily find themselves overwhelmed by the forces they sought to control. There were stories of Volvas who became lost in the otherworld, trapped in the spiritual realm forever. There are also accounts of Volvas who were consumed by the power they invoked, losing their sanity or their lives in the process. The risks were high, but for those who practiced Seeder, the rewards were equally great. The ability to commune with the gods, see the future, and manipulate the forces of nature made the Volvas some of the most powerful figures in Norse society. In the end, the rituals of the Volvas were not just about magic, they were about connection. They were about linking the mortal world to the divine and ensuring that the forces of nature, fate, and the gods were in harmony with the lives of the people. The Volvas didn't just wield power. They were the custodians of an ancient understanding of the world that transcended time, space, and the limits of human perception. Through their rituals, they connected with forces beyond our comprehension. Bringing back and exploring the rituals and practices of the Volvas is essential to consider not just the spiritual dimensions of their work, but also the profound cultural and social roles they played within Viking society. While the Volvas were undoubtedly spiritual guides and keepers of ancient knowledge, Their influence went far beyond the ritual space. They were integral to the functioning of Norse society, acting as advisors to kings, warriors, and common people alike, and their actions often had real, tangible consequences in the world of the living. The Vikings, who live in a world where survival was dependent on unpredictable forces, nature, fate, the will of the gods, sought guidance from the Volvas in almost every aspect of life. From the outcomes of raids and battles to the success of crops and the well-being of livestock, the Volvas were consulted to ensure that the cosmic order was aligned in favor of the people. Their ability to see into the future, communicate with the gods, and manipulate the forces of nature made them not just spiritual figures, but also political and social influencers. The importance of the Volvas was so profound that their advice was considered invaluable, even to the most powerful rulers. Norse society, with its deeply ingrained belief in fate, also placed significant importance on the role of prophecy and foresight. The concept of Wyrd, which was essentially the Norse understanding of fate and destiny, was a driving force in the way that the Vikings lived their lives. It wasn't just that individuals were born with a predetermined fate. Rather, they believed that Wyrd could be influenced and shaped by actions, choices, and even by the power of the gods themselves. This belief in fate and the idea that it could be manipulated was central to the role of the Volvas. Their ability to access the divine, see into the future, and alter the course of events was based on the understanding that fate was not a fixed path, but a dynamic force that could be guided through ritual and divine intervention. One of the most important aspects of the Volvas' practices was their ability to foresee the future. Norse sagas are filled with examples of Volvas who could predict the outcomes of battles, the rise and fall of kings, and even the fates of entire clans. This was not simply a matter of foresight for personal gain. It was about ensuring that the future unfolded in a way that was in harmony with the gods' will. The Volvas did not see the future as something to be feared or avoided. Instead, they saw it as a landscape that could be shaped. A Volva might foretell the outcome of a raid or predict a kingdom's future prosperity, but she was also capable of using her insights to help others align their actions with the forces of fate, maximizing the likelihood of success. In a society where success often depended on the favor of the gods and the manipulation of fate, the Volvas provided crucial guidance. The practice of prophecy was not just about reading signs and omens. However, the Volvas engaged in active rituals, often involving complex chants, symbols, and sacred objects, to commune with the gods and spirits. These rituals, which might take place in sacred groves, around ritual fires, or in specially prepared spaces, were designed to open a gateway between the worlds. When a Volva entered these ritual spaces, her consciousness would transcend the mortal realm, allowing her to perceive events that lay beyond the ordinary scope of human vision. In this altered state, she would engage with the gods, the spirits of the dead, and the forces of nature to obtain knowledge of the future. The relationship between the Volvas and the gods was reciprocal. The gods didn't merely impart knowledge to the Volvas. They required offerings and sacrifices in return. This was not a one-sided relationship. It was an exchange of power and energy. The Volvas would offer sacrifices, sometimes of animals, but in some instances, it was believed that the Volvas themselves might make sacrifices of a more personal nature, offering part of their life force, or even undergoing dangerous spiritual journeys that could place them in jeopardy. These sacrifices were necessary to gain the favor of the gods, and they were seen as part of the natural order. The gods, in return, would grant the Volvas the knowledge and power they sought. This reciprocal relationship was at the heart of the Volvas' practices. Another key aspect of the Volvas' role in society was their connection to the realm of the dead. Death, in Norse culture, was not an end, but a transition to another state of being. The dead continued to have influence over the living, and the souls of ancestors were believed to provide guidance and protection. The Volvas played an essential role in ensuring that the dead were properly honored and that their spirits remained connected to the living. Through rituals, The vulvas would guide the souls of the deceased to their final resting places, whether to the cold, dark halls of hell or to the glorious feasts of Valhalla. The vulvas believed that the spirits of the dead had a vital role to play in the ongoing story of the living. In addition to guiding the souls of the dead, the vulvas could also communicate with these spirits, receiving wisdom and guidance from those who had passed on. This was not seen as a mere act of necromancy, as modern sensibilities might interpret it. Instead, it was viewed as a sacred duty. The spirits of ancestors were not removed from the world of the living. They were an ongoing part of the community's collective fate. The vulvas could tap into this spiritual network to gain insight into the present and the future, seeking guidance from the ancestors or receiving messages from spirits. The role of the vulvas was particularly important in times of crisis. During times of war, when Viking warriors were preparing for raids or battles, the vulvas were called upon to offer their prophecies and guidance. Kings and warriors would seek the counsel of the vulvas to determine the likely outcome of their endeavors, and to ensure that the gods would be on their side. The vulvas could tell them what sacrifices needed to be made, what actions would bring about success, and which strategies would lead to failure. Their advice was often sought before important battles, and their words could influence the course of Viking military campaigns. In many ways, the vulvas acted as the moral and spiritual compass of Norse society. Their rituals were not simply concerned with personal gain or fortune. They were about ensuring the alignment of human actions with the divine will. The vulvas helped to maintain the cosmic order by guiding their people through the complexities of fate, providing protection against chaos, and ensuring that the laws of the gods and nature were respected. Their role was to mediate between the mortal world and the spiritual realms, to ensure that the balance between these two worlds was maintained. In this sense, they were not just spiritual guides, they were also the enforcers of cosmic justice. The vulvas were also deeply connected to the natural world. The Vikings believed that the forces of nature, wind, rain, thunder, and the seasons, were not mere physical phenomena, but living divine entities. The gods themselves were often associated with natural forces. Thor, for example, was the god of thunder, while Freya governed fertility and the cycles of nature. The vulvas were attuned to these natural forces and had the ability to communicate with them. They could call upon the elements to bring rain for the crops or to calm the stormy seas. They could also invoke the power of the earth, the wind, or the fire to affect the outcome of events. The vulvas understood that the natural world was not separate from the spiritual. It was an extension of it. This connection to nature gave them a unique power, as they could influence both the human and natural realms. But the influence of the vulvas extended beyond the material world. Their powers were also used to shape the moral and ethical fabric of society. Through their prophecies and spiritual insights, the vulvas helped to maintain social order, ensuring that individuals and communities remained aligned with the God's will. They provided counsel on matters of justice, ensuring that the balance between right and wrong was upheld. The vulvas were often called upon to mediate disputes, offer guidance on the proper course of action, and ensure that individuals lived in accordance with the divine principles that govern the universe. It's important to note that the vulvas were not always viewed as infallible figures. While they were revered and respected, their prophecies were not always accepted without question. There were occasions when their predictions proved to be wrong or when the outcomes diverged from what had been foretold. This does not diminish the respect they commanded. Rather, it highlights the Norse understanding of fate and destiny. The vulvas did not claim to have absolute control over fate. They understood that the future was shaped by countless factors, and that even the gods themselves were sometimes subject to the forces of fate. In the end, the vulvas were integral to the very structure of Norse society. They bridged the gap between the mortal and spiritual worlds, shaping the course of events and ensuring that the cosmic order was respected. Through their prophecies, rituals, and guidance, they played a critical role in maintaining the balance of the universe. The vulvas were not just figures of magic. They were agents of fate, mediators between the gods and the practice of seed, the profound and often misunderstood magic wielded by the vulvas was not simply a set of rituals or ceremonies performed on the whim of the practitioner. It was a deeply spiritual practice that shaped the lives of the Norse people and played a pivotal role in their understanding of the cosmos. The power of cedar lay not just in its ability to predict the future, control elements, or commune with the dead, but in its ability to bridge the realms of the gods and humans, to alter the course of events, and to align the individual with the cosmic flow of the universe. To truly understand the impact of cedar, we must explore its origins, its methods, and its extraordinary potential. In Norse mythology, cedar was often associated with the goddess Freya, one of the central figures of the Norse pantheon. Known for her beauty, wisdom, and magical prowess, Freya was also a master of cedar, teaching its practices to others, including the gods themselves. However, despite its association with such a powerful figure, cedar was not universally embraced within Viking society. While Freya was revered as a goddess, the practice of cedar was often met with suspicion, particularly when practiced by women. This was partly due to the nature of cedar, which allowed its practitioners, often women, but not exclusively so, to access power that threatened the patriarchal structure of Viking society. It wasn't just that cedar was perceived as a form of magic. It was the way it allowed individuals, particularly women, to step outside the traditional roles assigned to them by society and engage with divine forces in ways that were previously unimaginable. The association of cedar with women had a profound impact on how it was viewed. While Norse society was built on a warrior ethos, where strength and valor were considered the highest virtues, cedar was a magic that demanded a different kind of power, one that was more internal, subtle, and intangible. In many ways, cedar was a form of resistance to the dominant social structures of Viking life. The practitioners of cedar, usually Volvas, were not fighters, nor were they bound by the same rules of honor and combat that governed the warriors. Instead, they drew their power from a connection to the spiritual world, and in doing so, they wielded a form of influence that transcended the physical strength of the warriors around them. At its core, cedar was a form of shamanic magic that involved entering trance states in order to journey between realms. In these altered states, Volvas could communicate with gods, spirits, and the dead, gaining access to hidden knowledge that was not available to the ordinary person. It was said that the practitioner would slip out of her physical body, transcending the limitations of time and space, and travel to distant realms where she could interact with otherworldly beings. This was not mere escapism. It was a spiritual and mystical journey with profound consequences for the practitioner and for those who sought her help. The ability to enter these trance states was not just a skill. It was a central component of the practice of cedar. Through the use of rhythmic chanting, drumming, and the invocation of sacred symbols, the Volva would shift her consciousness and enter a realm where she was no longer bound by the constraints of her physical form. In these trance-like states, the Volva could perceive hidden truths, see the threads of fate that connected individuals, families, and entire nations, and even alter the course of events. This ability to shape the future, to bend the flow of time and destiny, was one of the most powerful aspects of cedar. It was not just a matter of predicting the future. It was about shaping it, making subtle adjustments to the trajectory of fate to ensure that the right outcomes occurred. The rituals involved in cedar were as varied as the individuals who practiced them, but they all had a common purpose: to bridge the gap between the mortal world and the spiritual realms. The Volvas would often use tools such as staffs, wands, and runes, symbols that held magical power and acted as conduits between the human and divine worlds. These tools were not just props. They were infused with spiritual significance, each one carefully crafted to help the Volva access different realms and energies. Runes, in particular, were seen as powerful symbols with the ability to channel and direct magical forces. The specific use of runes in cedar could vary depending on the situation. Some runes were used for protection, others for divination, and still others for influence over natural forces. The practice of cedar could also involve sacrifices and offerings. In Norse society, the relationship between humans and gods was one of mutual exchange. The gods did not simply bestow their wisdom and power without expecting something in return. Offerings, whether in the form of food, drink, or even more significant sacrifices, were a way to honor the gods and ensure their continued favor. For the Volvas, this exchange was particularly important. They understood that the gods were not distant, omnipotent beings, but active participants in the world, and their favor was something that had to be earned. The Volva's offerings, therefore, were not just acts of devotion. They were ways of ensuring that the spiritual forces remained in alignment with the mortal world, ensuring that the gods would lend their power to the practitioners of cedar. The use of cedar was not without its risks. Entering the spiritual realms was a dangerous endeavor, and there were many stories of Volvas who became lost in the other world, never to return. The act of crossing between worlds was seen as perilous because the realms of the gods and spirits were not always welcoming to human travelers. The spirits that inhabited these realms were often unpredictable, and the gods themselves were not always benevolent. There was always the risk that the practitioner could become overwhelmed by the forces she encountered, or worse, lose herself completely in the spiritual world. The dangers inherent in cedar were not merely physical, they were spiritual. To practice cedar was to open oneself to the unknown, to venture into realms where the normal rules of reality no longer applied. One of the most intriguing aspects of cedar was its connection to the concept of fate, or WYRD, in Norse cosmology. The Volvas were often consulted to gain insight into the future, particularly in matters of war and leadership. Kings and warriors would seek the advice of the Volvas before embarking on campaigns, hoping to learn whether the gods would favor them in battle. In these moments, the Volvas were able to see the potential outcomes of these actions, and through their magic, they could often influence the direction of events. But it wasn't just the big battles that the Volvas could influence. They could also affect smaller, more personal matters, such as relationships, family dynamics, and the success of individuals. The Volvas understood that everything in the world was interconnected, and that even the smallest actions could ripple out and affect the course of fate. In this sense, their magic was not only about influencing large-scale events, but also about subtly guiding the lives of individuals toward their destined paths. The power of cedar was not confined to the past or present. It also extended to the future. The Volvas could see beyond the veil of time, perceiving possible futures and understanding the complex web of causes and effects that lay ahead. This ability to glimpse the future made the Volvas indispensable figures in Viking society. They were the ones who could provide insight into whether a battle would be won, whether a king's reign would be prosperous, or whether a crop would thrive. This foresight was often sought in moments of uncertainty, and the guidance provided by the Volvas was considered invaluable. However, it's important to note that the future was not seen as a fixed and unchangeable entity. The Volvas believed that the future was a realm of possibility, shaped by actions, choices, and the intervention of the gods. They did not predict a single, inevitable outcome. They glimpsed multiple possible futures and worked to ensure that the most favorable path would be followed. The role of the Volvas in warfare is one of the most dramatic aspects of their practice of cedar. The Vikings were a warrior society, and battles were central to their way of life. Volvas were often consulted before major raids and conflicts, as their insights could help determine whether the gods would favor the warriors in battle. The Volvas could also influence the outcome of these battles by working with the spiritual forces at their disposal. Some Volvas were believed to have the power to send protective spells to shield the warriors from harm, while others could call upon the spirits of the dead to give strength to the living. Their rituals were not just about predicting the future. They were about altering it, shaping the course of events to ensure that the warriors would be victorious. In some cases, the Volvas themselves played a direct role in warfare. They were often seen as conduits for the gods, channeling divine power into the world through their magic. In battle, they might chant powerful incantations that invoke the aid of the gods, calling down the power of Thor's thunder or Freya's fertility to ensure that their warriors would emerge victorious. The Volva's role in battle was not merely symbolic. It was an active and integral part of the Viking approach to war. Despite the extraordinary power of seeder, the mystical practice of seeder was deeply interwoven with the very fabric of Norse society, and the Volvas who practiced it were seen as the bridges between the material world and the spiritual realms. Yet, the practice of seeder was not universally accepted, nor was it understood in the same way by all members of Norse culture. The complexities of gender, power, and social roles heavily influenced how seeder and its practitioners were perceived. For many, the practice was a source of both awe and fear, an enigmatic force that defied traditional norms and expectations, especially when it was practiced by women. It was within this tension between reverence and suspicion that the Volvas operated, shaping the world with their magic while also navigating the limits placed upon them by the culture they inhabited. The intersection of seeder and gender is one of the most fascinating and complex aspects of its practice. While it was not exclusively a female craft, seeder was overwhelmingly associated with women, and this connection had profound implications for both the practice itself and the role of women in Viking society. In Norse culture, women were often relegated to domestic roles, bound by the rigid expectations of family and household. They were not typically warriors or kings, and their influence on public affairs was often limited. However, the practice of seeder gave women a unique form of power that allowed them to transcend these traditional roles. By engaging in the sacred rituals of seeder, women could step into a space where their power was not defined by physical strength or political influence, but by a deeper, spiritual connection to the cosmos. This connection to seeder was seen as both a blessing and a curse. While the Volvas wielded incredible power, their magic was not always welcomed by everyone in Norse society. The association of seeder with women threatened the established order, particularly the warrior ethos that defined much of Viking society. The very act of women engaging with the divine, entering trance states, and wielding influence over fate was seen as a challenge to the patriarchal structures that governed the culture. Some accounts from Viking sagas and historical texts suggest that men were often uncomfortable with the idea of women controlling magical forces that had the potential to shape the destiny of men and nations. It wasn't just the seeder itself that provoked fear. It was the fact that this magic was largely practiced by women. In a society where male prowess was celebrated, the idea that women could hold such potent power was unsettling to many. Despite the social challenges they faced, the Volvas played an indispensable role in the Viking world. Their influence reached far beyond matters of magic and ritual. They were crucial to maintaining the balance of the cosmos. The belief in fate and destiny was deeply ingrained in Norse culture, and the Volvas were seen as the keepers of knowledge about how fate could be altered or influenced. The gods themselves were not exempt from the workings of fate, and even they relied on the Volvas to help shape the future. Odin, the All-Father, was said to have sought the counsel of the Volvas in moments of great uncertainty, asking them to help him navigate the threads of fate and secure victory in battle. Kings, warriors, and common folk alike turned to the Volvas for guidance, and their ability to foresee the future or manipulate the elements made them invaluable to society. The Volvas did not simply provide answers. They also engaged in actions that could shift the course of events. Through their rituals, they were able to invoke the gods, seek wisdom from the dead, and even influence the outcomes of battles. One of the most remarkable aspects of seeder was its active nature. It was not a passive form of divination, but a magic that allowed the practitioner to engage with the divine in an active and purposeful way. The Volvas didn't just predict the future, they shaped it, using their power to bend fate to their will. This dynamic role in shaping destiny was a key reason why the Volvas were so respected, but it also made them vulnerable to suspicion and fear. It's important to understand that seeder was not a uniform practice. Each Volva would have had her own methods, rituals, and understanding of the magic. Some might have focused more on divination and prophecy, while others might have been concerned with healing, controlling the weather, or ensuring the success of crops and animals. However, at its core, seeder was always about connection, the ability to connect with the gods, the dead, and the spirits of nature, and through these connections, to influence the world of the living. This deep, almost symbiotic relationship between the physical and spiritual realms was what made Cedar such a powerful force. The Volvas were not just mystical figures. They were also healers, protectors, and guides. In addition to their magical powers, they often used herbs, potions, and other natural remedies in their healing practices. This aspect of their role was deeply tied to their connection with the natural world. In a culture where illness and injury were common, the Volva's knowledge of natural remedies was indispensable. They could use plants and other natural substances to heal wounds, treat diseases, and ease pain. The Volvas were also believed to have the ability to protect individuals or entire communities from harmful forces, both human and supernatural. This could include protection from enemies, curses, or malicious spirits. Their ability to manipulate the natural world through both magical and medicinal means made them a central figure in Viking society. The role of the Volvas in warfare was particularly noteworthy. As war was a central part of Viking culture, the ability to influence the outcome of battles was a crucial skill. Before important raids or conflicts, Viking leaders and warriors would often seek out the counsel of the Volvas, asking them to use their magic to predict the outcome of the battle. The Volvas could tell if the gods would be on their side, if victory was assured, or if disaster was imminent. Their magic could also be used to ensure that the warriors would be protected, either by calling upon protective deities or by manipulating the forces of nature to shield them from harm. In some instances, Volvas were even known to accompany warriors into battle, offering their magical services on the front lines. The influence of Cedar in battle was not just about foretelling victory. It was also about preparing the warriors mentally and spiritually for the trials ahead. The Volvas were often seen as spiritual leaders, helping the warriors to connect with the gods and tap into their divine strength before going into battle. This could involve rituals of empowerment, invocations of strength and courage, and even blessings for the fallen. The connection between the Volvas and the warriors was one of mutual respect. The warriors understood the importance of the Volvas' magic, and the Volvas saw themselves as protectors of the warriors, ensuring that the gods would favor them in their struggle. While Cedar was most often associated with the Volvas and their role in Norse society, it is important to note that the practice was not exclusively for women. Although the majority of Cedar practitioners were female, there are accounts of male practitioners of Cedar, particularly in the later Viking Age. These male practitioners, however, often faced a different set of challenges. In a society where masculinity was largely defined by strength, courage, and warrior prowess, a man who practiced Cedar could be seen as less masculine or even emasculated. The social stigma associated with male practitioners of Cedar was significant, and it often led to ridicule or exclusion. Despite this, there were still men who engaged in the practice, and their role in Cedar further complicated the traditional gender dynamics of Viking society. As we explore the role of the Volvas in Viking culture, it is crucial to understand the broader context in which they operated. They were not isolated figures. They were part of a complex web of spiritual, social, and political forces. The Volvas' influence was not limited to the practice of magic. They were also integral to the social structure, providing wisdom, guidance, and support to the community. They played a role in ensuring that the society remained in alignment with the divine will, offering insight into the future, making decisions on behalf of the gods, and ensuring that the spiritual and physical realms were in harmony. Their presence in the Viking world was as much about maintaining balance and order as it was about wielding magical power. The legacy of the Volvas continues to fascinate and intrigue us today. While much of their practice has been lost to history, traces of their influence can still be found in the sagas, in the surviving tales of Viking heroes and gods, and in the archaeological remnants of their rituals. The image of the Volva as a powerful, mystical figure connected to the gods, the spirits, and the forces of nature continues to captivate our imagination. They were women who defied the norms of their time, using their unique connection to the spiritual realms to shape the destiny of their people. In a world defined by physical power and warfare, the Volvas wielded a different kind of magic, a magic that was subtle, profound, and ultimately transformative. Their legacy reminds us that power is not always about brute strength, but about understanding the deeper currents that shape the world and the ability to influence them in ways that others cannot. The relationship between the Volvas and the gods is central to understanding the deeper mechanics of Seidr and its significance in Norse society. To the Norse, the gods were not distant, abstract entities that existed beyond the confines of their understanding. They were active participants in the world, influencing its workings at every level. In turn, the Volvas, as the intermediaries between the divine and mortal realms, held a unique position within this cosmic framework. Their power was not solely derived from their own abilities, but was deeply rooted in their direct communication with and invocation of divine forces. This connection with the gods provided them not only with knowledge and wisdom, but also with the authority to act on behalf of the gods themselves. The most prominent of the gods connected to Seidr is Freya, the goddess of love, fertility, and war. She was not only revered for her beauty and power, but also for her mastery of magic, particularly Seidr. It is said that Freya taught the art of Seidr to the Aesir gods, including Odin, who would later become one of its most famous practitioners. Freya's role as a goddess who could manipulate fate, foresee the future, and influence the course of events positioned her as a central figure in the practice of Seidr. Her association with Seidr helped to shape the practice's spiritual and social importance, placing it at the intersection of both the divine and mortal realms. Freya was the one who enabled the Volvas to tap into divine power, and her presence in these rituals was not just symbolic. It was an active force, shaping the outcomes of the Volvas' work. To fully appreciate the nature of the Volvas' relationship with Freya, it is important to understand how the Norse viewed their gods. The gods in the Norse pantheon were seen as not just powerful beings, but as beings whose actions were deeply entwined with the fate of the world. Unlike the gods of other mythologies who might reside in distant, unapproachable heavens, the Norse gods interacted directly with the world. They influenced the seasons, the cycles of life and death, and the course of human events. For the Volvas, it was through their communion with these gods that they were able to shape the world around them. The rituals performed by the Volvas were designed to establish a direct link between the mortal and divine realms. These were not merely symbolic acts. They were believed to be powerful enough to influence the course of fate itself. Through Seidr, the Volvas could ask the gods for knowledge, guidance, and power. They could use this divine assistance to alter the future, foresee impending events, and even influence the outcomes of battles, political decisions, and personal matters. In this sense, Seidr was not just a form of magic. It was a means of invoking divine will, aligning the mortal realm with the cosmic order dictated by the gods. One of the most important aspects of the Volva's relationship with the gods was the ability to receive divine knowledge. In Norse cosmology, knowledge was not simply a matter of intellectual understanding. It was something that was bestowed by the gods, something sacred and powerful. The Volvas sought this knowledge not only for personal insight, but as a tool that could be used for the benefit of the community. They acted as intermediaries, receiving divine wisdom, and then translating it into practical advice for kings, warriors, and the people. This knowledge could pertain to anything from the best time to plant crops, to the outcome of an impending war, to personal matters of love and relationships. For the Volvas, knowing how to align the forces of fate with the desires of the people was a profound responsibility, one that demanded deep spiritual insight and wisdom. In addition to receiving knowledge, the Volvas could also invoke the gods to influence the natural world. This was particularly important when it came to matters of agriculture and the health of the community. The Norse were a people deeply connected to the rhythms of nature, and they understood that their survival depended on favorable conditions. The Volvas could call upon the gods to ensure that the harvest would be bountiful, that the winds would be favorable for a voyage, or that the animals would remain healthy and fertile. These acts were not simple prayers. They were rituals that harnessed the divine power of the gods to actively influence the course of events. The relationship between the vulvas and the gods also extended to their role in warfare. In the fiercely competitive and warrior-centric society of the Vikings, the gods played a critical role in determining the outcomes of battles. The gods themselves were often seen as patrons of warriors. Odin, for example, was revered as the god of war, and he was believed to guide and empower those who fought on his behalf. The vulvas were instrumental in calling upon these gods to intervene in battle. Before major raids or conflicts, the vulvas would conduct rituals to invoke the gods' favor, ensuring that victory would go to their side. These rituals often included offerings, chants, and sacrifices, all aimed at ensuring that the divine forces would align with the warriors in battle. The gods, however, were not always easily appeased. They were temperamental and unpredictable, and their favor could not always be guaranteed. The vulvas understood this, and their rituals reflected a deep understanding of the balance between devotion and sacrifice. The relationship between mortals and gods was not one of entitlement. It was a reciprocal exchange, where the gods provided their assistance in return for offerings, respect, and adherence to their will. The vulva's ability to read the signs of the gods, to understand the flow of cosmic energy, was crucial in ensuring that their rituals were successful. It wasn't just about performing the ritual. It was about understanding the subtle cues from the gods and the spiritual forces that govern the universe. The role of the vulvas in maintaining the balance between the gods and the people was also evident in their work with the dead. In Norse society, death was not seen as an end, but as a transition to another state of being. The spirits of the dead were believed to continue to influence the living, and the vulvas were tasked with ensuring that these spirits were properly honored and that their presence was felt in the world of the living. The vulvas could communicate with the dead, seeking their guidance and wisdom in times of need. The spirits of ancestors were often seen as powerful forces, and the vulvas could call upon them to provide assistance or advice. This was not merely necromancy in the sense that modern culture understands it. It was a way of maintaining a connection between the realms of the living and the dead, ensuring that the wisdom and power of the past continued to shape the present. Through all of these practices, the vulvas acted as agents of divine will, serving as intermediaries between the gods and the people. Their ability to commune with the divine allowed them to shape the world in ways that others could not. However, their power was not without its dangers. The gods, as powerful as they were not infallible, and they could be wrathful and unpredictable. The vulvas had to constantly navigate the delicate balance of invoking the gods' power while remaining mindful of the potential consequences of angering them. Their rituals, though potent, were fraught with uncertainty. Even the most skilled vulvas could find themselves overwhelmed by the forces they sought to control. The relationship between the vulvas and the gods was also a deeply personal one. The gods were not seen as faceless, distant entities, but as powerful beings with whom the vulvas had a direct relationship. This connection was based not only on ritual and sacrifice, but also on trust. The gods were seen as beings who could be trusted to provide wisdom and guidance, but only if the vulvas were able to prove themselves worthy. The vulvas understood the importance of maintaining a respectful relationship with the gods, and their magic was seen as a means of honoring the relationship. The practice of seed, therefore, was not just about manipulating forces for personal gain. It was about maintaining the integrity of the cosmos, ensuring that the natural and spiritual worlds remained in harmony. The vulvas understood that their power was derived from the gods, and they used it to ensure that the people of the world were aligned with the divine will. Their role in the spiritual life of the Viking world was not only about the performance of magic. It was about maintaining the sacred balance between the realms and ensuring that the people's lives were in tune with the natural and divine order. Through their connection to the gods, the vulvas were able to tap into a vast and mysterious source of power, one that allowed them to shape the future, alter fate, and influence the course of events. Their relationship with the gods was not just one of supplication. It was a partnership, one where the Volvas acted as the intermediaries between the divine and the mortal realms, ensuring that the power of the gods flowed into the world in a way that was beneficial to all. The practices of the Volvas were not limited to just ritual and prophecy. They were also intricately tied to the societal and political structure of Viking culture. The Vikings, known for their seafaring raids and warriors, were also deeply spiritual people, and their belief systems permeated every aspect of life, from the mundane to the divine. For the Volvas, their position within the social hierarchy was far more complex than that of other figures of authority, blending elements of spiritual leadership, community guidance, and sometimes even political influence. In many ways, the Volvas were not just seen as seers or witches. They were viewed as vital members of the community whose knowledge was critical to ensuring the well-being and prosperity of the people. Viking society, like most ancient societies, was a place where the unpredictable forces of nature, the whims of the gods, and the capriciousness of fate could make life uncertain and dangerous. It was within this environment that the Volvas performed their most vital role, helping to maintain a sense of balance and order, both in the physical world and the spiritual realm. The Volvas understood that to survive in such an unforgiving world, the people had to be in harmony with the forces of nature, and that harmony could be achieved only through ritual and understanding. The Volvas were called upon to guide their communities through difficult times, from crop failures and famine to impending wars and internal strife. It was not uncommon for Viking kings and chieftains to seek the advice of a Volva before embarking on a significant raid or political maneuver. The wisdom that the Volvas provided was not just about predicting outcomes. It was about knowing the most favorable course of action to align with the will of the gods and the forces of fate. In this way, the Volvas acted as spiritual advisors to the rulers, ensuring that their decisions would be in accordance with the divine order. The role of the Volvas in Viking society extended beyond that of advisors. However, they also played a significant part in reinforcing the social order. In a warrior society where physical prowess was highly valued, the Volvas offered a counterpoint to this valor. Their magic was subtle, ethereal, and often associated with feminine power. This made the role of the Volvas somewhat controversial in a society that revered physical strength and combat ability above all else. In fact, many male warriors found it difficult to accept the authority of the Volvas, as their power was not based on physical prowess, but on spiritual insight and the manipulation of unseen forces. Yet, despite the skepticism and occasional hostility toward them, the Volvas were undeniably important to Viking society. The Volvas wielded their power not through physical might, but through knowledge that was gained through deep spiritual practices. This knowledge gave them an edge in understanding the movements of the cosmos and how those movements could be harnessed for practical purposes. For example, the Volvas might be called upon to perform a ritual to ensure that a raid would succeed. This could involve calling upon the gods for blessings, offering sacrifices to ensure victory, or divining the best route to take to avoid natural obstacles. In a world where success in battle was crucial to maintaining status, wealth, and honor, the guidance of a Volva could make the difference between victory and defeat. One of the key features of the Volvas was their deep connection to the divine forces. Their magic was not considered their own, but rather a conduit through which the gods worked. They were not seen as wielders of power in a traditional sense, but rather as intermediaries, receiving wisdom, strength, and guidance from the gods, and in turn, passing that on to the people. The Volvas were often called upon to ensure that the cosmic balance was maintained, which in turn would bring prosperity and protection to the people. If the people were suffering, it was often believed that the Volvas could either interpret the will of the gods to determine the cause of the misfortune, or could perform rituals to appease the gods and restore harmony. In times of crisis, such as during war or plague, the Volvas were especially revered. Viking culture was rooted in the belief that everything had a purpose and nothing happened by mere chance. When faced with a problem, whether it was a bad harvest, a threatening storm, or a rebellious faction, the Volvas were looked to as wise women who could understand and interpret the greater forces at play. They would not only interpret the signs and omens, but also conduct rituals that could directly influence the outcome. For example, if the Vikings were about to embark on a raid, the Volvas might perform a ritual sacrifice or a ceremonial chant to invoke the god's favor. In this way, the Volvas operated at the crossroads of spiritual and practical concerns, often solving problems that spanned both the mystical and the real world. The influence of the Volvas was not confined to their own communities either. Viking raids, which were often swift and brutal, carried the Vikings into the lands of distant peoples. During these raids, the Volvas might also be called upon to aid in the success of these expeditions. Their magic was not limited to the lands of their own people. It was understood that the god's favor could be sought no matter where one was in the world. A Volva would accompany a raiding party, guiding them with her magic, ensuring the gods were with them, and helping them achieve victory on foreign soil. The relationship between the Volvas and the warriors on these raids was often one of mutual respect. The warriors, though they may have been skeptical of the magic, understood the importance of keeping the gods happy, and they trusted the Volvas to act as their spiritual guides in the midst of battle. In many ways, the Volvas were also agents of social cohesion. Viking society, despite its emphasis on individual valor and warrior status, was still a tight-knit community that relied heavily on social cooperation. It was the Volvas who helped to maintain these social bonds, ensuring that everyone in the community understood their place and how their actions fit into the larger cosmic order. They were spiritual leaders, yes, but they were also community leaders. Through their rituals, they helped to guide the people not just in their spiritual lives, but also in their daily lives. The festivals and feasts that were held to honor the gods and the Volvas were not just for religious purposes. They were social events that helped to cement relationships within the community. These events helped reinforce the idea that the individual was part of a greater whole, bound by fate and the will of the gods. Yet, it is important to understand that the Volvas were not universally admired in the same way. Despite their spiritual power, they often operated on the fringes of society. Many Volvas were considered outcasts or recluses, living outside the normal social structures. Their connection to magic, particularly the powerful magic of seed, set them apart from the average person. In Viking society, where physical strength was highly prized, the intellectual and spiritual power of the Volvas was sometimes regarded with suspicion. The fact that they were often women only further complicated their status. While some respected the Volvas for their power and wisdom, others viewed them with distrust, often associating them with darker forces. The social position of the Volvas was a reflection of the broader tension within Viking culture. While the warriors and kings held power in the physical realm, the Volvas wielded power in the spiritual realm. This division often created friction between the two. The Volvas were independent figures, not easily controlled by kings or chieftains. While the rulers sought guidance and favor from the gods through the Volvas, they did not always understand or accept the authority of the Volvas. This tension between spiritual and temporal power is one of the defining characteristics of Viking society. The Volvas were not simply passive followers of the gods. They were active agents, shaping the fate of their people in ways that went beyond the physical realm. Despite the social complexities that surrounded them, the Volvas were indispensable to Viking society. They acted as both spiritual leaders and social architects, guiding their people through the uncertainties of life with wisdom derived from divine sources. Whether advising kings, performing rituals to ensure success in battle, or simply offering guidance during difficult times, the Volvas were central figures in Viking life. Their power was rooted not in physical strength, but in their ability to navigate the unseen realms, making sense of the forces that govern the world and ensuring that the community remained in harmony with those forces. It was this unique combination of spiritual insight and community leadership that made the Volvas so vital to Viking society and why their legacy continues to captivate our imagination today. The rituals and practices associated with Cedar were deeply integrated into the very fabric of Viking religious and spiritual life, serving not only as tools for personal insight, but also as instruments of divine connection and cosmic alignment. At its core, Seeder was an ancient form of Norse shamanism, rooted in the belief that the world was governed by unseen forces, spirits, gods, and the vast, flowing currents of fate. For the Volvas, the practitioners of Seeder, their rituals were far more than ceremonial. They were transformative acts that bridged the gap between the physical and spiritual realms, altering the very nature of reality itself. The rituals they performed were a means of navigating the intricate web of fate, a web that could be influenced, adjusted, or even rewoven through careful spiritual work. The central ritualistic component of Seeder involved the act of entering a trance-like state, which was believed to be necessary for the Volva to communicate with the gods, spirits, and otherworldly beings. This trance was achieved through various methods, most notably chanting, rhythmic drumming, and the use of sacred objects such as staffs or wands. These physical and auditory cues acted as anchors, guiding the Volva into altered states of consciousness where she could transcend the material world and access the deeper, hidden layers of reality. In these states, the boundaries between time, space, and the self would blur, allowing the Volva to interact with beings from the spiritual and divine realms, travel between worlds, and manipulate the unseen forces of the cosmos. In many ways, these altered states were considered a form of journeying, a mental and spiritual odyssey to realms beyond human comprehension. The practice of Seeder was not a passive form of magic, but an active, transformative process. When in a trance, the Volva would often experience vivid visions or receive prophetic knowledge, often related to the fate of individuals or entire communities. The knowledge gained from these spiritual journeys was then passed on to those who sought guidance, and it could range from foretelling future events to offering advice on how best to navigate the unpredictable currents of fate. For example, a Volva might foretell the outcome of a battle or a raid, warn of impending disasters, or reveal hidden truths about relationships or conflicts. The act of divination through Seeder was often perceived as a way to understand and influence the future, but it was also about recognizing that the future was not set in stone. The Norse believed in Wyrd, a concept closely related to fate, but one that was not immutable. The Volvas understood that while there were certain paths that destiny seemed to set in motion, there were also choices and actions that could be taken to influence those outcomes. Seeder provided the Volvas with the means to engage with the threads of fate, to understand their complexities, and in some cases, to alter them. This was not a magic that simply predicted events. It was a power that allowed the practitioner to become an active participant in the shaping of the future. The trance-like state induced during Seeder was a means of entering a spiritual otherworld, a place where the practitioner could commune with gods, spirits, and ancestors. This otherworld was not a realm of mere fantasy or illusion. It was a space where the laws of time, space, and reality were malleable. It was here that the Volvas could perceive the interconnectedness of all things, tapping into the threads of fate that bound people, events, and even entire nations together. In this world beyond the physical, the Volva could perceive not only the past and present, but also multiple potential futures, each shaped by the choices and actions of the people involved. The practice of Seeder was deeply tied to the idea of fate's fluidity. While certain outcomes might seem inevitable, the Volvas believed that they could influence the course of events by aligning themselves with the divine forces and understanding the hidden patterns of the universe. One of the most crucial elements of these rituals was the use of sacred objects. The Volvas would often carry staffs or wands, which were believed to act as conduits for magical energy. These objects were more than just physical tools. They were symbolic representations of the connection between the practitioner and the divine. By using such tools, the Volvas could focus their energy and intent, channeling the powers of the gods and spirits into their work. Runes, the sacred symbols of the Norse people, were also integral to many Seeder rituals. The runes themselves were considered to hold immense power, and each one had its own specific meaning and purpose. Some were used for protection, others for divination, and some could even be used to influence the forces of nature. The careful use of runes and cedar was an essential part of the ritual, as they allowed the vulva to tap into the cosmic order and align her actions with the divine will. The act of chanting was another key component of cedar. The rhythmic chanting, often accompanied by drumming, was thought to serve as both a way to enter the trance state and as a means of invoking the gods. These chants were often composed of powerful words and phrases that had been passed down through generations, each syllable carrying with it the weight of ancestral knowledge. The vulvas would chant these words to call forth the divine and to ensure that their actions were aligned with the cosmic forces they were trying to influence. The chanting served to focus the vulva's mind, allowing her to transcend her physical body and enter the other world, where she could commune with the gods and spirits. Sacrifice, too, played an important role in many seed rituals. The Norse believed that the gods required offerings in return for their assistance, and the vulvas often conducted rituals that involved sacrifices to ensure divine favor. These sacrifices could take many forms: food, drink, or even the offering of animals or other valuables. The act of sacrifice was a way to demonstrate devotion and gratitude, but it was also a means of ensuring that the gods remained aligned with the needs of the people. A sacrifice was not merely a gift. It was an exchange of energy, a pact between the mortal and divine realms. It was through this exchange that the vulvas could gain access to the divine power necessary to carry out their rituals. The vulvas were also deeply connected to the natural world, and many of their rituals were tied to the cycles of nature. The changing of the seasons, the phases of the moon, and the movements of the stars all held spiritual significance. Rituals conducted at specific times of the year, such as the solstices or the equinoxes, were seen as especially potent as they aligned with the rhythms of the earth and the cosmos. The vulvas understood the significance of these natural cycles and would often use them to time their rituals and divinations. The changing of the seasons was seen as a reflection of the eternal cycle of life, death, and rebirth, and the vulvas would align their work with these cycles to ensure that their actions were in harmony with the natural flow of the world. While much of the vulva's work centered around seed or the manipulation of fate, their magic was also used for more practical purposes. They were often called upon to offer protection, particularly during times of war or danger. The vulvas could cast spells to shield individuals or communities from harm, whether from natural forces or human enemies. These protective spells were often seen as essential for ensuring the safety of the community, especially during times of conflict. In battle, the vulvas were believed to have the power to send blessings of strength and protection to the warriors, ensuring that they would be shielded from harm and that their efforts would be successful. The connection between the vulvas and the warriors was one of mutual respect, as the warriors understood that the vulva's magic could turn the tide of battle in their favor. Healing was another vital aspect of cedar. The vulvas were not only spiritual guides and advisors, they were also skilled healers. They used herbs, potions, and magical rituals to treat the sick and wounded, often in ways that blended practical medicine with spiritual healing. The knowledge of plants, herbs, and other natural remedies was passed down from one vulva to another, and this knowledge was considered sacred. The vulvas understood that illness was not just a physical affliction, but a spiritual imbalance, and their healing practices sought to address both the body and the spirit. By restoring balance to the person's spiritual and physical state, the vulva could help them recover from illness or injury. The rituals of cedar, therefore, were multifaceted, deeply spiritual, and intricately tied to the needs of the community. The vulva's power lay in their ability to traverse the boundaries between the mortal and divine realms, to manipulate the unseen forces of fate and nature, and to offer guidance, protection, and healing to those who sought it. Through their rituals, the vulvas were able to shape the world in ways that transcended the limits of physical reality, offering a glimpse into a hidden world of cosmic forces that governed the very fabric of existence. The practice of cedar was not just a form of magic. It was a means of understanding and interacting with the deep currents of the universe, a means of aligning the mortal world with the divine. As the practice of seidr was deeply rooted in the spiritual and mystical elements of Norse culture, its preservation, suppression, and eventual transformation during the Viking Age and beyond was both an inevitable and tragic shift. The evolution of seidr into a practice that was less understood and often vilified is tied to a complex blend of cultural, religious, and political forces that ultimately led to the marginalization of this once powerful tradition. The widespread conversion of the Norse peoples to Christianity, the rise of more centralized power structures, and the cultural shifts that accompanied the transition from paganism to monotheism played crucial roles in the decline of seidr. For centuries, seidr had been a deeply embedded part of Norse spiritual life. The Volvas were revered, their rituals integral not only to the social and religious fabric of Viking society, but also to the very survival of these communities. Their connection with the gods and spirits, their role as seers and healers, and their ability to manipulate fate gave them a unique authority and power. They were viewed as figures of wisdom and mystery, capable of influencing the course of events in ways that transcended the ordinary, and their skills were indispensable in an unpredictable and often violent world. In many ways, the Volvas personified the Norse understanding of the world, one that was filled with hidden forces that could be understood and even manipulated, but only by those who had the knowledge, the insight, and the divine connection to do so. Yet as Christianity began to spread across Scandinavia, the old ways of worshiping the gods and interacting with the divine were increasingly seen as heretical, even dangerous. The Christian missionaries and leaders who sought to convert the Norse people viewed the practice of seidr and other pagan rituals as expressions of devil worship and the occult. For the new Christian authorities, the ability of the Volvas to invoke the gods and spirits, particularly through their trance-like states and powerful rituals, was seen as a direct threat to the monotheistic worldview they were trying to impose. As Christianity began to take root in the Viking lands, the practice of seidr was increasingly marginalized and vilified, casting a shadow over the centuries-old tradition. The transition from the Old Norse faith to Christianity was not an instantaneous process. It was a gradual and often contentious shift. Viking society was not monolithic, and many of the old traditions, including the practice of seidr, persisted for centuries despite the growing influence of Christianity. For a time, the Volvas may have continued to practice their craft, albeit in secret, preserving their ancient knowledge and rituals away from the watchful eyes of Christian authorities. But over time, as the Christian church gained more power and influence, the practice of seidr was increasingly suppressed, and its practitioners were increasingly seen as outcasts and witches. This suppression of seidr was not only religious but also political. As Viking societies became more centralized, the power structures that emerged were often built on the principles of control and hierarchy, with kings and chieftains seeking to consolidate their power in ways that made traditional spiritual practices like seidr seem subversive. In a society that was increasingly oriented toward military and political might, the influence of the Volvas, who had long operated outside the established power structures, was seen as a challenge to the new status quo. The Volvas' role as spiritual leaders, healers, and keepers of knowledge threatened the authority of the emerging political elites, and as a result, their practices became increasingly marginalized. One of the most striking aspects of the suppression of seidr was the shift in the perception of its practitioners. Where once the Volvas were seen as respected figures with deep spiritual insight, capable of guiding their communities through uncertain times, they were now often labeled as witches or heretics. In Christianized Norse society, the word seidr became synonymous with dark magic, and the practice was linked to accusations of witchcraft, heresy, and devil worship. The Volvas, once revered as women who could commune with the gods, were now seen as dangerous women who had made pacts with evil forces. The transition to Christianity created a stark dichotomy between the old gods and the new Christian God, between pagan magic and Christian faith. In the Christian view, The gods of the Norse pantheon were not divine beings to be worshipped, but were demonic entities, and the rituals associated with them were viewed as acts of rebellion against the one true God. The practice of seidr, which had been central to Norse spirituality, became a symbol of paganism's supposed evils, a practice that was no longer seen as a means of divine connection, but as an act of defiance against the Christian worldview. As a result, seidr, and by extension, the vulvas, were increasingly persecuted, and the practice was driven underground. The suppression of seidr was not just a religious or cultural phenomenon, but also a social one. The vulvas were often seen as women who operated outside the bounds of traditional gender roles, women who held power and influence in ways that were not bound by the expectations of Viking society. In a society that was already deeply hierarchical and patriarchal, the vulvas represented a challenge to established norms. Their ability to wield spiritual power, their connection to the divine, and their influence over both the fate of individuals and the fate of entire communities placed them in a unique position of authority that made many uncomfortable. As a result, when Christianity spread and the social order became more rigid, the vulvas were often forced into the margins, their power diluted by the new structures of authority that sought to replace the old ways. In the medieval period, the practice of seidr began to disappear from the historical record. By the time of the Icelandic sagas, which were written in the 13th century but reflect earlier Norse traditions, the vulvas had become increasingly rare. The sagas, which preserved many of the old stories and legends of the Norse gods and heroes, made mention of the vulvas, but the context in which they appeared was often one of nostalgia or romanticization. In these later accounts, the vulvas were often portrayed as figures from a bygone age, ancient seers whose wisdom had faded in the face of the new religious and political order. Their once powerful role in Norse society was now relegated to myth and legend, as the practice of seidr itself was lost to history. Despite the decline of seidr and the disappearance of the vulvas as spiritual leaders in Viking society, traces of their influence can still be found in the folklore and traditions of later cultures. The image of the wise woman, the witch, and the seer who can communicate with the gods and spirits continues to appear in European folklore long after the end of the Viking Age. These figures are often depicted as possessing knowledge of ancient magic and wisdom, and their practices are sometimes presented as remnants of an older, pre-Christian way of life. The association between women and magic, particularly the ability to influence fate and control the unseen forces of the world, continued to be a powerful theme in folklore and mythology, even as the practice of seidr itself faded from public life.